And Uzi's going to quit making weird noises. All right. And we're in KiTisa. That general vicinity, like I said a couple weeks ago, I really feel like we're following a thread through here. And it's not so much based on, like, say, tearing down the specifics of the furniture in the Mishkan, but putting it back into the context again of the garden. I know we focused on resurrection last year, but I'm still concerned about the garden because really that's our focal point of the resurrection. If we're going to be resurrected, then what are we going to be resurrected to? And how is it, that everything in the scripture is just so intimately woven together that words that we've read 1,000 times, I can read it this year, and all of a sudden it's like I've read it for the first time. I've seen that particular application for the first time. So with KiTisa, it's interesting because we're at a point in scripture where sometimes it feels like, because we're out of the narrative, because Bereshit is so much narrative. And then you get into Shemot, you're still in the narrative, but it will stop periodically and give you heavy sets of details. For instance, like Mishpatim, it's going to go into details about law. And then it might go into the Mishkan, which is what I'm interested in, but I could have focused on a different section, which was slipping back into a different narrative about the golden calf. Less about the building of the Mishkan and more about, well, this horrible thing happened, and if the tradition is right, it prevented them from moving back into the land and moving into a state of immortality. So yes, that's a huge failure, but I want to go back to the Mishkan itself because we looked at it last week in the context of the Merkava, the four living creatures, heavenly chariot, whatever you want to call it, looking how it seemed like the seraphim and the cherubim, they're in some way associated with the presence of this heavenly chariot that traditionally, and I don't know if I mentioned this particular tradition, I may not have because it wasn't exactly salient to the lesson, but there is a tradition that it is the heavenly chariot or the Merkava that actually transports you into this heavenly region. And so Elijah getting into a heavenly chariot is very much consistent with that tradition, or maybe that's exactly where the tradition developed from. It's kind of a chicken or egg proposition. But your means of transport would be this heavenly chariot that does have wheels, but other than that, it doesn't appear to be much like any chariot that we would be familiar with, because it really does have that kind of the image there of the rivers of Eden, the circling rivers of Eden, circling one within the other. And that's where you realize what a fiery place Adam and Eve must have lived in that garden, because it talks about, stick your hand in there and take out these fiery coals and so forth. And so the idea that we could be restored to such a place and that such a fire would not burn us, just like it wouldn't burn the burning bush, which wasn't burning. Maybe they should have named it the wasn't burning bush, but at any rate, it was a flame. It just wasn't burning up. And the idea that we could dwell in such a place of a fire that's called chashmal, which, like I said, it's the modern Hebrew word for electricity, where it goes really fast. It's like the chariot itself. It goes really fast. It's like a streak of lightning. But to be able to dwell in such a place without harm, to the physical body, or I would say at this point, the resurrected body. What Ezekiel is seeing is perhaps visionary. He's not actually there, but he's able to see what's there, because probably I would think the fire would burn him up in a physical body. Who knows? I don't exactly understand how visions work, and there's better qualified people than me to talk about dreams and visions. At any rate, let me share the PowerPoint. And what we'll do tomorrow too is rather than have this expanded lesson on the Torah portion, what I'll do is I'll do KiTisa tonight. And then for tomorrow's class, I'll do a little overview of Purim based on a question a student emailed in about why does it say, I think it's in the Gemara, or it might be in a Midrash, that in the Olam Haba, the world to come, that the only feast that's going to be celebrated is going to be Purim, and the rest are going to be done away with. Now, I don't think that's exactly what it's saying. Sometimes when you read a Midrash, or when you read something like the Gemara, you have to understand that it was written as something that had always been orally transmitted, and therefore there would have been an explanation that went along with it. And the explanation is missing when you read the Talmud. The explanation is missing when you read the Mishnah. The explanation is missing when you read the Gemara. The missing explanations will cause more questions than answers. That's why you have to be really savvy if you're going to go and use those sources, or if you're going to reference those sources. You have to be careful not to be hyper literalist when they make a statement like that. It might be one of those teaching statements. For instance, which I'm getting off track a little bit and I don't want to, but there's two different accounts. If you read the commentaries of what happened with the golden calf, which is in our Torah portion, so I guess it's not exactly a rabbit trail. One account says that it was the mixed multitude that was responsible for the golden calf. They called them the rabble, that they actually stirred people up, the mixed multitude, it was all their fault. You read another account, and in this account, it says it was the young men that ate and drank on the mountain. And they beheld basically the sapphire brickwork of the throne. It says they ate and drank, and then, the text says, and Adonai did not break out on them. He did not kill them. The implication is that he probably could and should have, because they were doing something improper. They were gazing at holiness without any sense of modesty or humility. They got caught up into the ecstatic experience, and therefore what they were doing was out of line. They should not have been eating and drinking on the mountain and gazing at the presence. And he says, these are the young men that Moses took up on the mountain with him. And therefore, when they came down off the mountain, as Moses is gone to receive the rest of the Torah, they have been so charmed. I don't know if that's the right word, but you can fill in the right one. I'm having a Joe Biden moment. But they were so enraptured, maybe, with that experience that they just didn't want to come down off that mountain, basically. And so they were the ones who stirred the people up. They were the ones who wanted to continue in this ecstatic spiritual experience. They didn't want to come back down to the everyday level. Once you've been caught up to that level, I can imagine it would be hard to come down and just get into like the mundane stuff that was left on the, the note on the door that Moses left when he went away. Like, okay, study these Big 10 while I'm gone. Well, who wants to study the Big 10 when you've gazed at the presence, whatever that appeared to them to be? And it says they were the ones who stirred it up, and they were the ones who killed Hur. Remember Hur, who helped hold up Moses' hands, one of his arms? It says that they wanted him to build an image, and basically his response was, over my dead body, and then they obliged him. They killed him. And so when Aaron saw it, that's what it says in the text. It says, I think in most translations, when Aaron saw this, it doesn't say what he saw. But it's basically when he saw what they had done to Hur, that they had murdered Hur because he wouldn't make them an image, and called them out for their sin. That's when he did the golden calf. And so you've got two completely different accounts of who was at fault for the golden calf. One is going to say the young Israelite men. One account is going to say the mixed multitude from Egypt. Each of those is teaching you a lesson. All right, what's in the Torah, that is truth. It is written. But many times when you read a tradition, it's a teaching lesson. And so either way you read that, there's a teaching lesson. One says, if you just bring a mixed multitude of people into your congregation, they likely are going to cause trouble because that's their background. They've had an idolatrous background. They could cause trouble. You need to beware. The other part of the tradition teaches as well, because it tells you that when you go up and you have this ecstatic experience, that you can get, what does it say? So heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. You just don't know how to come back down to earth and get down to the nuts and bolts of living. And you can actually cause people a lot of problems. And so those are teaching lessons. But I want to take that idea, part of that question, the response or the tradition that these other feasts will be done away with and Purim will be the only one. I don't think that's literally what they're saying. And tomorrow I want to go into what I think they're saying. And so I'll do a little presentation from the book of Esther. And basically it's one that I've taught on before. You may have actually even seen the program before, but I just want to isolate the sections that are a comparison between the life of Joseph and Esther and Mordecai, so that you can see that all the feasts are contained within the book of Esther. Even Yom Kippur, especially Yom Kippur. Except, it's like we said last week, with the light, when you say or is becoming light. It just means you're becoming light. You become that thing which shines. Purim is like that, where the actual name of Hashem is hidden in the text. You know for sure he's at work. There's no doubt he's at work. And so it's a matter of saying those things that which have been concealed in this world, we only know that they're concealed because we know what's behind the concealment. If we didn't know what was behind the concealment, then we would completely miss these pictures that are in the book of Esther. So we'll go through and we'll look at those things, and then you can see an example of why they might have said Purim will be the only feast celebrated in the Olam Haba. It's not a literal statement. It's bringing attention to the more spiritual aspect of the feasts, because right now, see, if we become hyper literal, we'll say, well, every single thing about the feast must continue to be done in all eternity. Well, it's not even being done right now. I mean, you might have some group out there, some isolated group trying to do a Passover lamb sacrifice, but for the most part, the answer is no. People are not sacrificing lambs because there's no temple, there's no priesthood. We're not sacrificing goats on Yom Kippur. So it's not as if the universe will fall if every detail of those feasts is not kept, because some of them obviously are place and time specific. And when conditions change, things change, but nevertheless, like in the book of Esther, we can see that these things do actually continue. Even if we're not in Israel, even if there's no temple, even if there's not a Levitical priesthood functioning, these things are still happening because these are still appointed times. So in fact, let me just stop that and share something different. So I want to show you the Psalm from this week. This is Psalm 75. And I think it'll just sum it up. I use this a lot in the creation gospel to help people understand how eternal the appointed times are. So in Psalm 75, it says, "We give thanks to you, O God, we give thanks, for your name is near. Men declare your wondrous works." That's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at the creation. "When I select an appointed time, it is I who judge with equity. The earth and all who dwell in it melt. It is I who have firmly set its pillars, Selah. I said to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up the horn. Do not lift your horn up on high. Do not speak with insolent pride." And then it goes on and it talks about the judgment of the wicked. And finally it says the horns of the wicked will be cut off, but the horns of the righteous will be lifted up. Right. But the premise of the psalm is right back here with Psalm 75 too. He says, "When I select an appointed time, it is I who judge with equity." And so the psalm is telling us when we see judgments, and this is very much on our minds this week, because what have we experienced within the last few weeks? We've experienced a virus that has completely upset the world, not just the United States, not just Cincinnati. It's upset the world. I'm just waiting on a flight cancellation from United Anytime for our Passover trip. Because I just saw in the news Israel's going to quarantine incoming for 14 days, or home quarantine for 14 days. I'm thinking, well, that's even longer than our trip. So obviously there's going to be some disruptions with travel. In fact, I had to book my travel out to Denver to do a government contract on the 24th. And with the money they gave me for the trip, I was able to upgrade to first class and still had $80 left over. That's how much ticket prices have fallen. I'm like, this is awesome. You know, I could learn to get used to this. But that flight may not fly, because it's over half empty at this point, and I'm just it's on the 24th and this is the 9th, that those flights should not be half empty. So yes, we've got a plague, a virus that's disrupting the entire world. We just had a tornado rip through Tennessee, or tornadoes, plural, rip through Tennessee. There's all sorts of things going on. I think the stock market plunged big time today. It's every day it's something drastic. And so what does that tell us? Well, we go back to Psalm 75. He says, "When I select an appointed time, it is I who judge with equity." And often as we get closer to a moed, we're getting very close. Well, Purim is tomorrow. We're getting very close to Pesach. And then we're going to start this counting towards Shavuot. And it seems like, man, the judgments are getting heavier every day. If you just look at the headlines, it's like bam, 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 bam. The closer we get to Pesach. And I've always told people, you don't have to worry too much about looking for the chametz at Pesach, because at least a couple weeks beforehand, around the 1st of Nisan, if not even before that, the chametz will come out of the woodwork on you. I mean, stuff you didn't even know was there will crawl out and say, deal with me. And sometimes it's a person and sometimes it's you. You know, you don't know where it's going to come from, but it does. It ramps up at the appointed times, because even though there are times of celebration for us, there are also times of judgment, which is what this psalm is saying. When you see the appointed times, understand at the same time, I have a plan for my children to celebrate. I also have a plan of judgment, and certain things are going to happen. So look right here at the interlinear in the Hebrew. It's ki ekach, and that's when I take, just like when you take a wife. It's interesting. It's the same lokeach. It's the same verb. to take. When I take a moed, okay, I will basically fairly, meshar, and then eshput, I will judge. I will judge fairly. So what is happening at the times of the Moedim is a fair judgment. And as time progresses, the judgments, I think, will be more and more noticeable at those appointed times. So as time goes on, what we may notice, especially as we move into the Messianic era, and the evil inclination is bound for 1,000 years, Satan is bound for 1,000 years, then those appointed times, there may be less judgment in terms of bad stuff, right? Because judgment is fair. If there's nothing horrible to judge, then obviously it would become much less intense. But that's what these appointed times do. They are times of judgment. And then it says, I'll pull this interlinear up for you too. The earth and all who dwell in it melt. It is I who have firmly set its pillars. Now this is referring to the appointed time, the moed that we saw in verse 2. And so he says, I firmly set its pillars. Okay, right here is the word for pillars, amud. Amud. And omed means to stand. If you've studied a little bit of Hebrew, you might have learned to say ani omed, or if you're female, ani omedet. And that means I'm standing here. I stand. Okay, it's the same word for a pillar, amud. So an appointed time is a pillar. It's something that continues to stand. Even if you don't tangibly see it in the physical world, it still stands in the spiritual world. Just like when we're talking about the Mishkan, the boards, the wall around it, they were boards and they were set into silver sockets. And they were like pillars. They had to stand in their sockets. Right? So it represents that which is eternal, that which endures. Now in eternity, it may not have the same appearance, especially since we're talking from the realm of the physical world. Will the feast look different in eternity? I imagine so. Because our only experience with a feast has been in a fallen world. Imagine celebrating Pesach, whatever it was originally intended to be at the creation, without sin having entered into the world. To us, it's going to be a transformation of the feast because we have never experienced Pesach outside of a fallen world. So it may be like a brand new thing to us, even though we're familiar with it. Okay, so we'll stop sharing on that. And now we'll go back to this. Slideshow player. Okay, is that showing the PowerPoint or is it still showing the Bible thing?
PowerPoint.
Okay, great. We're on track. All right, so KiTisa, when you take a census, and I wanted to show you how linguistically related these two Torah portions are. That, of course, we've had one in between. We've had Tetzaveh. But when we look at KiTisa, there is a linguistic relation to teruma. A couple weeks ago. Nasa means to lift, to bear up, to carry, or to take. And then teruma, it's actually a type of offering, but it's from ruma, and you're familiar probably with a two-letter root ram, aram, the land of Aram, which means high and lofty. If you've been to Israel and you've been to places where it will say Ramat, like Ramat Gan, or Ramat Golan, what that means is the high place. It's kind of set up. So it's a lifted up place. So it means, again, to rise up, to be lofty, to be high, to be exalted. So there's a linguistic connection between the two of them. There's also a contextual connection between the two of them, because the first one, yes, it's talking about the Mishkan, and it's talking about the voluntary offerings of the Terumah. But in this portion, KiTisa, there is a mandatory offering, right? There's a required half shekel for the Mishkan service so that the sacrifices can be purchased and so forth. In other words, this may or may not be true. If any of you have done fundraising, you can correct me, but this is kind of my experience. If there's a pressing need for something, if, like, let's say there has been a disaster, the help will just pour in for that need. But it may be that that particular project needs help long term in order to sustain it. And then over time, the donations into that project will tend to decrease because you don't have the shock, I think, or in the case of the Mishkan, that exciting, oh, I can be a part of this. Well, being part of something every day is not nearly as exciting as being part of something that only happens once, ever. Because there was only one Mishkan once, ever. And so imagine how exciting that would have been. They could say, I can contribute to the one and only Mishkan. And that would have, to me, to have been much more, I would have been elated to do that. But in terms of bringing in a half shekel, over time, something that has to be reproduced on a continuing basis, that's less exciting. And so, that's the big job of fundraising, is how do I keep people excited about this project, because the need won't go away over time. They're going to have a beautiful Mishkan, but if they can't buy the sacrifices, it won't be doing much but sitting there being purty. So that's kind of the issue here. So you got two types of offerings, and you're going to have homework. By the way, based on these two Torah portions and the little bit of difference in the way that the offering is brought to the Mishkan, with Terumah, it being a voluntary thing, and then with KiTisa, where it's not voluntary and everybody brings the exact same amount. See, with Terumah, there was really no limit until Moses finally just said, okay, everybody quit. This is way more. But up until then, you could have brought a whole tent full if you wanted to. In KiTisa, it's just bring the half shekel. It's no big deal. Just bring the half shekel. And I want to look at the two different types of parables that Yeshua taught. I want that to be your homework this week. I want you to go through there and compare and say which one to you is speaking of a KiTisa frame of mind, and which of these is speaking to me as a Terumah state of mind. All right, so we'll move on from here. And in KiTisa, ideally, this would be one we would read every word together, and we would have something to say about almost every verse. But we don't have time to do that. We've got about 30 minutes. So there's going to be certain themes in KiTisa. It'll start with a census. And this is where, remember, I know some of you already have this book, which is the Revised Workbook 2. Remember last week I said I'd help you a little bit with the Torah portion thing in the back. If you look in the back of it, I've made empty sections here with the Torah portions where you can make your notes. And so if you're doing that as you go along, I'm going to try to include a slide for that in each week. But if you're doing that, for Teruma, you already have information there, but let's slide down to KiTisa. So when you elevate, basically when you take this offering, and an offering is something that is elevated. It's set aside for a holy purpose. But in this Torah portion, you're going to find themes of taking a census, right? The Chagim, it's going to talk about Pesach. It's going to talk about Shavuot. It's going to talk about the firstborn. It's going to refer to Moses' 40-day fast up on the mountain. It's going to talk about the incense compounding. And there's some more things in there, but those are things I think that you will find again. Remember, we're trying to say the whole point of doing this is if I'm reading over here in the Gospels or Revelation or the epistles, and I see a topic that puzzles me, I say, wait a minute. All right, it says that in the time of this particular Roman emperor that he took a census. Okay, where is my referent for taking a census? I go back, I slide down, I say, oh, KiTisa, it starts out with a census. Well, let me see what kind of stuff is in KiTisa, and then let me go back and read the first, depending on which gospel, maybe one chapter, maybe two, maybe three. It's going to be the opening chapters of each of the gospels, by the way. And if you go back to the opening chapters of each one of the four gospels, you will find themes, not just these. These are like the more evident ones. You'll find other ones too. And so, and I just took as examples, Luke 2:1 through 52. If you look at that chapter, talking about, basically, you know, it's the feast. You can read the codes within the chapter and say, oh, it's talking about the fall feast. This is talking about the Feast of Sukkot, simply because of the language that's being used, like good tidings of great joy and so forth. But then you get down to like, okay, they're saying, according to the custom of the Jews, they needed to bring Yeshua into the temple and go through this ceremony, go through this process. And you say, well, you know, it really is the same topics of KiTisa. It talks about a census when Joseph and Mary had to go up to Bethlehem and so forth. Now I have context. And so if you want additional homework, you can read the first 1 to 3 chapters. It'll depend on the gospel, and you will pick out way more than just what I've got listed here, where you won't just see like the firstborn and the lamb and so forth. It'll even talk about, you know, like where it's talking about the Chagim in the Torah portion, talking about Pesach. Well, within those first 3 chapters, it'll even talk about when they left Yeshua in the temple at Pesach and left and thought he was with the group and he wasn't. And so where does he stay? He stays in his father's house. Well, this Torah portion is about the father's house and its construction and so forth. Okay. So it says on the, actually I've just changed channels on you, but we really are in the same topic. I'm going to go back to the setting up of the tent of meeting, or the Mishkan. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, Exodus 40, because it gives us the GPS in terms of time. It says, on the first day of the month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. And that's interesting too, because the Mishkan has several different names. And sometimes people want to make it two different things. They want to say, well, the tent of meeting was different from the tabernacle. Because Moses would set it up outside the camp. Yes, he would. Apparently, that was on a limited basis until the Mishkan was ready, because he calls it the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. So it's two but one. So it says, now on the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. And so this gives us basically the first of Nisan, when the Mishkan is going to go up. Rabbinic tradition places the beginning of the creation on the first of Nisan, the first of the months. And now you're going to say, well, now wait a minute. I read in the tradition that Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, was the beginning of the creation. You have to keep reading. Remember, when you're in rabbinic literature, you have to be really, really careful sometimes and just keep reading, because you might be reading one source that doesn't have the complete story. Or you might be reading a website that has pulled a sentence out of somewhere and lost the context. If we keep reading, they say that it was at the Feast of Trumpets when the thought or the intention of the creation took place on the first day of the seventh month. But the actual creation didn't start being spoken until the first of Nisan. So it was basically two beginnings, one being thought-based and one being action-based. So this is not a new or a novel idea. This is an older idea, but I wanted to point it out and take it maybe step by step so that you can see the comparison and in some cases the contrast between the creation and the Mishkan. And lots of commentators point this out based on the language. And the Hebrew, I've tried to put at least sections of the Hebrew text in there for you to see, so that you can compare the verbs, primarily the verbs. And the verb we're looking for the most part, is going to be oseh or asa. Now you'll be looking at different constructs in terms of future tense, because it might be imperative and you might get down into grammar stuff. But basically, you're going to look for the ayin and the sin. All right, if you can find the ayin and the sin, you're probably on track. And I tried to put it in bold for you, because these makings, oseh means to make or to do. All right, so we start with Genesis 1:7. It says, God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. So God made, right? That's the key word there. When we go over to the Mishkan, there's a commandment in Shemot 25:8. It says, let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. Well, this is a case where if you're just relying on the English text, you might miss that it's the same word. Basically, he says, let them do, or let them make a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them. So again, it's oseh is going to be the verb there. So in the same way that Elohim made the expanse of the heavens, they were ordered to make a sanctuary, a mikdash. We'll notice too, in this particular case, he's referring to the Mishkan as the mikdash. right? And then he says, excuse me, the Shakanti, and I will dwell, right? Which is where you get Mishkan. You can hear Shachan or Shochen, the root word there, which means to live or to dwell, all right? And this is where they get the word Shekhinah, which is like the indwelling presence. And so at this point, even though we know he's talking about the Mishkan, he refers to it as the Mikdash. So we know that there is a correlation between the Mishkan and the Mikdash. It's seen as, the Mishkan is seen as a kind of Eden regained. In other words, if you remember the two cherubim, one of the traditions about the two cherubim is that the faces had male and female forms. And it was seen as a kind of invitation for the male and the female to return to the divine presence. They had been sent out of the garden, and now they're being invited back in to an extent. They're invited, it's a way of preparation where they can experience the presence basically without being killed. So you'll look in these comparisons that we're going to do. We're going to look at things like make, which is oseh or asa, see, complete, bless, sanctify, work, and behold. There's going to be parallels between the creation and the Mishkan. So first, we want to look here. Again, it's got a couple of different names. Actually, it has more than this. I think it's called the Tent of Testimony also. But it's called the Ohel Moed, which means a tent of meeting. Remember in Psalm 75, it talks about the appointed times. When I set an appointed time, it is I who judge with equity. So he's saying these moedim, these meeting times, which in Psalm 75, he says are also times of judgment, but these meeting times that he makes with us are centered around this tent. A tent, which is also a temple, a mikdash. Right? It's a sanctuary, it's a holy place. So yes, it's a tent of meeting. It's also a mishkan, a place for his presence to dwell. So as an Ohel Moed, it's going to be the focal point of the Moedim. The special sacrifices for the Moedim are going to take place there and so forth. This helps us think of the fourth day of creation. Because remember, on the fourth day of creation, it says 2 great lights were made for the sake of the Moedim. If you've done workbook 1, you've heard that 100 times at least, for the sake of the Moedim. So when we think of the fourth day of creation, we think about all the feasts. Remember, it's the central pillar of the menorah, and the other 6 branches of the feast are going to come out from there. So those 2 great lights of the sun and the moon, those are signs. We can look at them and say, you know what, we do have to look at those luminaries in order to be able to know what time it is, to be able to calculate our calendar for the sake of the Moedim. Somehow, this Mishkan is involved in that process. It's called the Ohel Moed. So it's also going to be at the center of the Moedim, possibly for the sake of the Moedim. We might use the same language. And it says in Genesis 1:16, God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. Right, so there's our key word, ya'as. Remember, it means to make. So he made those luminaries. And the key word, the key verb there is to govern, right? So these luminaries do what? They govern the day, they govern the night. And that's pretty profound. When you think in terms of the Moedim, that they were made for the sake of the Moedim, and they govern this calendar. And so that attribute of government, basically, when you keep these Moedim, you are telling the world who you believe created the world. And that's vital. Changing the times is, I believe that's a sign of the Antichrist. He wants to change the times. But when you return to the appointed times, and notice here, because I know we get all caught up in these crazy solar calendars or completely lunar without factoring in the solar so that the seasons stay on in the right time. The more crazy people get with these calendars, the more they're moving away from this right here. In order to understand the Moedim, you have to account for both lights. You have to account for both the sun and the moon. He says they both were created, they both were made to govern. That's part of the process. And so, well, I'm not going to preach. We'll move on. It says, when referring to the Mishkan, we have another making commandment, the Asu. It says, they shall construct an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high. And if you were to read more closely into the text, that's from Exodus 25:10, and you can, I know you'll read the Torah portion this week. It tells you the ark was carried on 2 separating poles. That's really interesting. And the exact language there is badeh atzeh. It rhymes in Hebrew, badeh atzeh. If you want to talk about the poles, remember they go into 4 rings. We can talk about symbolic significance. When you see something in the number 4, you can always go back to the 4th day of creation. When he made the luminaries, the sun and the moon, and the stars, he says, and they were for the sake of the Moedim to govern the day and the night. And remember, in the spirit, it's going to represent the Ruach Adonai, right? That central pillar of the menorah. Now, it has 4 rings crafted into the ark. So when I think 4, I think authority. I think governing. And the poles themselves are badeh atzeh. And bad, when you see that 2-letter root, vet, dalet, it means separation. Remember, in the garden, you had a precious stone called dolach, and you had that 2-letter root, bad. What does it mean? It means to separate. All right, so it's interesting. They're not just 2 carrying poles, they are 2 separating poles. In fact, it says separating trees. It doesn't really say poles. It is a tree, but we know they're poles. And so these are going to be the means by which the commandments traveled with Israel. Just like the luminaries that were created on the 4th day, they were the means of the light to separate lehavdil, day and night. And there again, you can see that 2-letter root of Beit Dalet, lehavdil, to divide. If you do the Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, little Havdalah ceremony, what are you doing? You are dividing the Shabbat from the other mundane work days. It's a little ceremony that says, it's traditional, and basically you've got this candle, you go ahead and do the blessing over the wine, You smell the sweet spices, so you remember the lingering smell of Shabbat. Then you take that candle and you're going to extinguish it in the wine. So that says, okay, now I'm free to go about my work business of the week. It's a dividing ceremony. It separates this from that. So we've got these separating poles that are slid into the 4 rings. So we've got 2 luminaries that were created to govern on the 4th day. The 4 signifying authority. So when you carry the commandments in this ark, you are carrying it with separating poles, like the day and the night, like the sun and the moon, which divided the day from the night. They separate the 2 things. And they are symbols of authority of what is contained within the ark. The ark is the ark of the testimony, the authority of the word. And so I just put this on there. I know you've seen it a million times, but just to take a peek at that 4th light on the menorah, just to remind you that that is the sun, the moon, and the stars. It's day 4, and that's the central pillar, the Ruach Adonai, from which the other 6 spirits of Adonai are branched off, or even from which the other 6 days of creation are branched off. But they're one thing. Remember, it's one piece of beaten gold. So sometimes things can be 2 things, but be one. They can be 4 things, but be one. They can be 7 things, but be one. All right, so. Okay, the next statement, or paired set of statements. And we're still looking for the oseh, the working statements. So in the creation, we hear in Genesis 1:25, God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And these are making statements. Again, the beasts are actually made like the luminaries. Right? We're looking for that specific language. The counterpart is going to be in the Mishkan. He says, you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, and 1 cubit wide, and 1.5 cubits high. And so in the Hebrew statements, you can see the parallel there. It's a making, whereas the Creator is making the beasts after their kind in some way in the Mishkan. When the Israelites made the table for the bread, it was similar to the making of the beasts after its kind, after their kinds. And you can see there, chayat. Last week we talked about the chayot and the chaya, how sometimes the 4 living beings are called chayot, plural, and then in some context in Ezekiel, it will say chaya, and it's singular. And you're saying, well, is it 1 or is it 4? And the answer is yes. Right? So these are beasts of the earth. They were made. And so we want to look for, well, what could possibly be similar between the 6th day of creation, creating the beasts after their kind, and in the Mishkan. Well, if you remember, that table of acacia wood was built, and it was overlaid with gold. It was made to hold the bread of faces. And of course, there's a loaf for each of the 12 tribes. And obviously, these are human beings. And so there is a difference. If we look at the 6th day of creation, the beasts are made first, but the human beings are made second. And we're told that Adam could find no beast corresponding to him. In other words, there was a separation between him and the beasts. Even though they had similarities, there was none that was suitable for a mate for him. And so this table, a shulchan, the root word of that is shalach, which means to stretch out. So you've got acacia wood overlaid with gold. It had feet. It's described as having feet. It also had carrying rings and carrying poles. And it also had a gold crown surrounding it, a border that went around it. And its tradition calls it a crown. But the language of it is interesting because, and I went ahead and put the Hebrew down there for you. It says that this piece that surrounded it, this misgelet, they were supposed to make this also, but it says it saviv ve'asit zel zahav lemiskeleto saviv. So twice in there you see saviv. Well, when we look at the rivers of Eden, those are going to be the first mentions of saviv, where you have the Pishon River, that saviv around the garden, and then you're going to have the Gihon River, that saviv around the garden. So there's two savivs, two saviving, I just made up a new word, two saviving rivers around the garden. And then the interior one, it said it walked, where there's no description of that source river in terms of how it moved, but it was the source. So we've got a matching set of verbs here, saviv, saviv, with the two rivers, right? And what would those rivers have done? They would have enclosed the garden. And remember, inside the garden, it's called good gold, right? And it's a proper name. It's not a description of the kind of gold. It's the name of people. It's a proper noun. And so if we look at the bread of faces, number one, they're human beings. It's what it represents as human beings, not beasts. It also represents the food of a human being before sin entered the world. There's nothing that says that he made the beast for us to eat up until a certain point. Before that, it's the trees, it's the plants, it's the herbs of the field that were created for us to eat. So it kind of takes us back into the garden, and it restores our dietary table. He said, this is what I had on the table for you. The things that I could bring forth from the earth were the things that I had for you when the rivers encircled you as good gold at that time. Next is Genesis 1:31. It says, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. We're still on the sixth day. And here's one of our extra words, vayoleh. Right? He saw all that he had made. And there's the asa. It was good. And then if we compare that to the Mishkan, it says Moses examined vayoleh, all the work, and behold, they had done it, just as the Lord had commanded. This they had done, so Moses blessed them. Well, that's significant, because if we look, and that was Exodus 39:43, by the way. If we go back to Exodus 20:11, it says, for in 6 days, remember, we're talking about the sixth day, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Right? So, what have we got here? Well, we've got the sixth day and then a rest. And then what follows is there's going to be a blessing of the Sabbath day and a making holy of the Sabbath day. What happens to the Mishkan? When they had finished the work, Moses does the same thing. He blesses them. All right, he examines it, he sees it, just like it says in the creation, and then he blesses them. So in the Mishkan, again, it takes us back to Eden. You can look at all the products that were required in the Mishkan, and those snails on the left right there, I dug out of that mountain, by the way. And that kind of greenish seam running through the mountain, that's down in the Arabah. I believe that's copper. The color's a little off to me, but it's more greenish when you get close to it. But at any rate, they're down here in the desert, they're in the wilderness, and these are the things they need. And ironically, everything they need is right here in this place, because they're on the trail down to Eilat. If they need porpoise skins for the cover, they've got it. If they need the snail dye, they've got it, because the sea is close by. If they need the worm dye, they're right there, again, on the incense trail. They need linen, it's right there on the trail. If they need wool, they've got their sheep. They've got acacia wood, which tradition says that they actually brought that from Egypt, from trees that Yaakov had planted. At any rate, there's shittim trees all over the place out there. There's copper, just like up in that mountain. It's all over that area. There's a silver mine south of where that mountain is right there. Gold, they're going to be able to get that again. They're on the trade route. You can see there's all kinds of rocks. I mean, you can't go anywhere without running into a rock. So they're going to have the undressed rock from the mineral world. And they're going to have plenty of earth, because remember, beneath that shell, it had to be earth, that they had to make an altar out of the earth. So everything they need is not only right there in the physical geographical location, but everything they need is taking them back to Eden, where the creation itself is actually contributing itself to the reestablishment of Eden. So, creation, Genesis 2:1, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts." And you can see the verb there is vayekulu and vekal. It's used twice in two forms. You compare that to the Mishkan, Shemot 39:32. It says, "Thus all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was completed. And the sons of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So they did." Well, you can see there that there's the doubled call as well. Kol avodat kekol. Right? You've actually got two makings there as well. You've got asu, asu. So right here we have an actual definition of something that is complete. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts." All right? When we compare it to its twin in the Mishkan, the very definition of all the work of the tabernacle being completed was that the sons of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded. That's the definition of something being complete. When you do the commandment, when you do all the commandment. And the hosts, remember, hosts can be heavenly bodies like the stars, but it can also be people, like large numbers of people. So when is the Mishkan complete? When large numbers of people do according to all that the Lord commanded Moshe. In both of these completions, it's drawing attention to something. Work. All right? The work of the 6 days being completed and the work of the Mishkan being completed. What's it completed for? The work leads to worship. In essence, the work is worship. But what follows is going to be a Shabbat. And this is when a different type of work takes place. It's avodah, it's worship. And remember, that's what we said was the intended complete duty of man in the garden. He had to do two things: work and worship, which means obey, and he had to maintain holiness. He had to guard the garden, those two things. And so as we compare the creation to the Mishkan, you can see that nothing has changed. They have opportunities to work, to restore the creation, to restore a place for his presence to dwell in them, and they have the opportunity to worship at the Moedim. The first Moed, being specifically stated, is the Shabbat, where work transforms into worship. Avodah is still avodah in Hebrew. And then the opportunity again to guard the garden. With the Mishkan, they now have the opportunity to do the same thing, which is where we got the symbolism again of the acacia trees. Next, Exodus 2:3, it says, "Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it." Because in it, and when you read that in Hebrew, you'll notice it says oto, because in him he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So you've got a play on words there. You can read it either way. In it he rested from all his work, or in him he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now that's awesome. You've got the rest of the week to unpack that one. And then you compare it to the Mishkan. Exodus 39:43 says, "So Moses blessed them." Blessing, blessing. Exodus 49. "Then you shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in it, him, and shall consecrate it, him, and all its furnishings, and it shall be holy." So we've got blessing, blessing, sanctification, sanctification. And in both cases, because of the pronoun, you can substitute him. All that is in him, and consecrate him, and all its furnishings, and it shall be holy. It's incredible, this restoration of the blessing of the seventh day and the holiness of the seventh day, not of the day itself, without the man, without him, and I believe without Messiah. See, I think Messiah is in this equation. But it says Elohim rested in it. He rested in all his work which he had created and made. In him. And that's the picture to us. Mankind can actually provide a resting place for Elohim. Because see, he created us, and when we rest on the seventh day, according to the commandment and according to the pattern of creation, according to all that he had shown to Moses, then we're like this creation that is now providing a resting place for Elohim. See, we thought it was all about just doing the rules, doing what he said. Oh, because if he rests, we have to rest. But think about a much more intimate picture of the creation, that when the man rests on the seventh day, see it there in the language, in the pronoun, the blessing, the sanctification. It's not just about the day. Remember, it doesn't say that man was made for Shabbat. It says that Shabbat was made for the man. Because this is how we invite Elohim to rest in us. We already know we rest in him, but has it ever occurred to you that when we rest on the seventh day, we're giving him the opportunity to rest, that we're creating a resting place for him? and why it's so important. He rests in Israel, just like he rested at the creation Shabbat. And so when we create a Shabbat, and that rest is from our heart, when it's voluntary, then it allows the Creator to bless us and make us holy. Shabbat was created, and in the Mishkan, it's recreated for us to restore that divine presence, which is exactly what he keeps promising, so that I can dwell among them. We create a resting place for him. So if we compare Exodus 39 and Exodus 40, we see a certain phrase repeated 7 times. And that phrase is, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Right? And remember, when we go back to day 4, which is really the central focus of the creation, govern was the key word. The 4th day corresponds to Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, which you'll read about in the Torah portion. The 4th feast. So, what can we say about this? This repetition, as the Lord had commanded Moses, 7 times. All right, what does that do? It throws us back to the creation. Again, because we know the relationship between the 4 and the 7. So in the 7 creation days, the universe obeyed. And Rabbi Sachs wrote this, and I thought it was beautiful. He said the universe was created as a place where God's will reigns supreme. God fills the space we make for him, and that is no small thing. So think about your Shabbat. We know all the things that we go through to even be able to make Shabbat. But imagine on Shabbat that what you're actually doing is creating a place where his will reigns supreme. And he will absolutely come in and fill that space we make for him. So you can make a little space for him on Shabbat, or you can make a lot of space for him on Shabbat. That's teruma. Remember, it was the freedom to come and worship and contribute however much you wanted to contribute. You can make your Shabbat as wonderful as you want to make it. However much you open your Mishkan to him on Shabbat is the degree to which he will move in to that space that you make. Just like in teruma, they brought a contribution. However much that Israelite wanted to open his heart to contribute, that presence would fill it. In this Torah portion, KiTisa, there's still an elevation in what's going on, but it stresses an equality of service. It says, whether you're rich or poor, you need to bring this half shekel. So you're all the same. You're all precious. But in teruma, you have the opportunity to make your space large for the presence to fill the tent. So we are both equal and not equal at the very same time. But if we look at these 7 makings of the Mishkan in Exodus 39 and 40, we see human beings obeying out of free will. And Rabbi Sachs says it is to tell us that nothing was made by human initiative. Every measurement, every item, every feature of every vessel represented God's will made actual by the freely assenting human will. And that's what we're supposed to aim for on Shabbat and the feasts, making that space large. He didn't hold back on the creation. If you think the Creator held back on the creation, you need to be watching Planet Earth and Aerial America and National Geographic, and you will realize how wonderful the colors, the textures, the complex systems of the deep ocean and the stars and the universe. No human being mind could ever contain all of the creation. He made it large for us. And when we open up our Shabbat to him, when we open up our Moedim and we say, hey, you know what? I want to give as much as I can into this Shabbat. I want to prepare as much as I can for this Shabbat. It's just like me building the Mishkan, so that when we move in, I have made a space for you because you first made a space for me. When you made this creation, and when you showed us the pattern of the Mishkan, you gave us something that we could follow, that we could understand. And that's pretty much the lesson for tonight, but I gave you some verses here to think about, because again, often words will shift on you, and you're not sure if it's two separate things or if these two separate things are one thing. So I picked these out of Revelation because they have to do with the tabernacle and the temple. In Revelation 7:15, you can see the relationship of the temple and the tabernacle. In Revelation 13:6, his tabernacle is people. Revelation 15:5, you get a more, I wouldn't say physical vision of the tabernacle, but again, you can see the interplay of the two words, the temple and the tabernacle. And then Revelation 21:3, it says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And I think this is a reference to those who have opened up that space of their hearts for him with those voluntary contributions. So this is your homework page. And your homework is to basically set up two sides of your paper, or if you do tables on Word or whatever you do, just make you two sections. One of them you're going to label KiTisa, and KiTisa is going to be the equal offering. Remember, everybody has to bring a half shekel. Now it's elevated, right? When we think in terms of resurrection, it's elevated, but everybody brings the same amount, or the men do. The next one, the next column is going to be teruma. And teruma, you can bring as much as you want for the Mishkan. Whatever is in your heart, however much space you make in your heart to give to his Mishkan, that's how much you can bring. And then I want you to scan through the Gospels and look through the parables. Now, some of the parables won't exactly apply, but some of them will. And you can think off the top of your head already. Some of the parables will teach you that everybody's equal. Some of the parables will teach you that to the degree that you have served, you have done work and worship, that is the degree to which you will be rewarded. And put them in one of the two categories. And I think what that would help you do is help you see that both things can be true at the same time. That we can all be equal, but according to the measure we've opened our heart, that's how much of the presence can get in. And so the reward of opening your heart more, the reward of making more, oseh, asa, the reward of doing all according to the commandments that he gave to Moshe, the more you open your heart up to that, the more he can move in and he can rest there. And it becomes a Shabbat for him. but it'll keep you humble as well, because we're all the same. I think it's just a good exercise. So we'll stop there.